coming to Ryukoku University Research Center for World Buddhist Cultures colloquium this evening. Friday afternoon. So, usually a little tired, but together. Tonight, we are very honored to have Dr. Louella Matsunaga as the guest speaker. And she is currently Louella Fellow visiting scholar at the Research Center for the World Buddhist Culture. She is currently at the program lead of Anthropology and Geography department at the Oxford Brookes University. And her tonight she is going to present the title is Soundscapes of the Pure Land, ? Music, Authenticity and Identity in Globalizing Jodo Shinshū. And we're going to have 5 to have this colloquium until 6:30. So, but okay, so she asked Dr. Matsunaga to have a presentation, and then we're going to the participants, including the people over the internet, also join us to discussion session later. So, but first, we have to let's welcome Dr. Matsunaga.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome, Professor Nasu. And I'd also like to thank Ryukoku University and the Numata Foundation for their generous support in allowing me to be here, and Professor Dake, who has supported me and been a great source of advice throughout this. I'm very happy to be working with him. And also thank you very much for your patience in setting everything up today to Guranga-san and Sui-san. And I'm sorry I caused you so much trouble with organizing everything. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I've called it Soundscapes of the Pure Land. And the subject of this is looking at the globalization of Jodo Shinshū through ritual and in particular through music. So I want to just start by giving, a little bit of context to this. This is part of a broader project on globalization and ritual in Jodo Shinshū, which I'm doing together with Professor Dake and Dr. Enrique Galvan Alvarez. And we hope to produce a book as a result of this. So one question that we might ask is, why look at ritual? What's interesting about ritual? How does ritual help us understand globalization? So my first answer to this is, ritual is a way in which people encounter religion in everyday life. So people may not be interested in theology, in the theory of religion, but they will encounter religion through various rituals. So I think it's important in that sense. Another aspect is ritual is very embodied, and it appeals to all of our senses. And I put a picture here on this slide of the Ryukoku at Otani Honbyo, which took place last weekend, as an example. So you can see the visual appeal of this ritual, the gorgeous robes, the brightly colored robes that the priests wear. There's also a sound dimension, music, chanting, and a dimension of smell, with the smell of the incense. So it appeals to and envelops all of our senses. And in this sense, ritual ritual can go beyond language. So even when people find the language of religion difficult or find the theories difficult, religion can go beyond that through ritual and appeal to people in a more direct way. And the third reason is ritual is culturally and socially embedded. I'm an anthropologist, so I have a particular interest in different cultures, different societies. And when we look at rituals, they are very much part of the culture, the society in which they take place. So in a sense, when we look at this slide, we look at the Ryukoku, the ritual that takes place at Otani Hongyo, we could think, oh, this is a very Japanese ritual. However, it also has strong influences from China. There are influences from China in the robes, in the styles of chanting, in the music. So although ritual is culturally embedded, it also travels. And as it travels, as it moves from place to place, it transforms, it changes. And the ways in which it changes can cast light on the process of globalization more broadly. So I want then to think about how, oh, sorry, the slide keeps jumping, how we understand globalization. It's a very popular word, I think in Japanese too. You often hear globaluka. People use this word a lot, but what do we mean by it? And there are different ways in which people have understood this. So one common understanding is it's a kind of acculturation. So you have a fixed center, things move out from that center to different places. As they move to a new place, they adapt to that local context. So quite a simple model, from a fixed center outwards, adapts in the local context. However, this has been challenged by a number of scholars. For example, Appadurai argued that this is not the way globalization works. He suggested, thinking about globalization, it's more like a landscape. You don't see a clear center. You see continuities. You see changes across space, but not in the sense of one center moving outwards. And he talked about different kinds of scapes, ethnoscapes, talking about movements of people, financescapes, talking about movements of money, technoscapes, talking about movements of technology, and idioscapes, talking about movement of ideas. So when I gave this presentation the title Soundscapes, I was thinking very much about Appadurai's model and thinking about how ritual music and sound transforms in terms of this image of a landscape. Two other scholars I want to mention briefly, Singh and Tweed, who have talked in a similar way to Appadurai about globalization in terms of flows across cultures. Singh talks about globalization as an uneven and contested terrain. It's not a smooth process. So you could think of it a bit like a river that flows but encounters obstacles, changes direction. And Tweed points out that these flows are not always one direction. They're exchanges, which is why he uses the term transfluence, talking about flowing across cultures, but not just in one direction. So what does this mean for Jodo Shinshū? How is it relevant? If we look at the context, first of all, I'm going to consider how Jodo Shinshū has changed, particularly focusing on music from the 19th century, late 19th century, the Meiji era. So to limit it to that period. This was a very important period in Japan, as most of you will know, because it was a period when Japan was going through huge transformations. And in the context of Buddhism, late 19th century transformations were not just in Japan. It was a period when Buddhism was reimagined as a global religion. And there were lots of contacts among different Buddhist groups throughout the world. And this beginning of an idea of Buddhism as a world religion. What is it? What is world Buddhism? The idea of a general Buddhism. And one milestone here was the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. That's the picture on the slide. And a lot has been written about this. There are some further references on your handout, and I'm happy to provide more references if anybody wants to contact me about this process of reimagining of Buddhism. But it was important, and it's important for the changes in music in Jodo Shinshū as well, as we will see later on. This was all happening at the same time as some other important developments, a push for modernization in Meiji Japan, and also Japanese migration to the United States and Hawaii in the late 19th century, which led to the establishment of overseas Jodo Shinshū missions. So these missions have a very long history, going back to a period when Jodo Shinshū in Japan too was going through a lot of change. And in this context, there was a repositioning of Jodo Shinshū, a pressure to adapt to a new era and to new local contexts. And what I want to argue here is this adaptation did not only happen outside Japan, but also inside Japan. So it's not just from the center outwards, the center stays the same, the outside changes. Change was happening everywhere. So the scope of this talk, I'm going to be looking at transformations of ritual, in particularly ritual music in Jodo Shinshū in 3 different contexts: Japan, the United States and Hawaii, and Europe. And I'm going to be asking, how has globalization been inflected differently in these 3 different places? What common threads can we identify? And what light can this cast on the process of globalization? So starting with Japan, with transformations from the Meiji period, I think the big theme here was jidai ni awaseru, adapting to the times. There was pressure to adapt to a rapidly modernizing Japan, and this affected ritual and music. So I'm going to look briefly at different types of vocal music in contemporary Jodo Shinshū. The 3 main types are shōmyō. By this shōmyō, I mean a particular kind of vocal music. I don't mean shōmyō as in chanting the name, different shōmyō. This is vocal music. Another form of music in Jodo Shinshū is dokkyo, so collective chanting of the sutras together. And thirdly, bukkyo ongaku, which is the name given to a Western style of music used in Buddhism. So in this section of the talk, I'm going to summarize the main changes in shōmyō and the introduction of bukkyo ongaku. So starting with shōmyō, It seems at first as if it might be the most traditional kind of Japanese music. Certainly as a foreigner coming from the outside, it seems like, oh, here is Japanese ancient tradition. And it certainly has a long history. It derives from Tendai Shōmyō. Before that, you can trace the origins of it back to China. And it uses a different scale to Western music. It's very, very different. However, Shōmyō actually changed quite a lot from the 19th century. First of all, in the middle of the 19th century, there was a systematization of Shōmyō in Jōdo Shinshū, and the first publication of Shōmyō collections with notations showing how to chant. And the first collection was in 1857. Previously, it had been transmitted orally from teacher to student. But with this printing of collections of Shōmyō, for the first time you have a guide to how to chant it, which can be disseminated more widely than just the teacher to student transmission. It also helps to standardize practice. And on this slide, you can see a very simplified form. This is the modern form of Shōmyō notation. But you can see already from the slide, the notation is completely different from Western musical notation. And in fact, the notation you can see here is the simplified form of Shōmyō, which was introduced in early Showa under Shōnyo Shōnin. So there was an initiative to reform Shōmyō and make it simpler. And the idea here was to make it easier for priests to all chant Shōmyō together at large ceremonies at the head temple. But even though it's simpler, it's still quite difficult to chant Shōmyō. It requires a lot of training. Chanting Shōmyō is part of chanting basic Shōmyō is part of the training of ordination in Jōdo Shinshū. But to chant more advanced forms of Shōmyō, you need a 6-month to 1-year course, training course at the Department of Ritual and Liturgy at Honganji. So it is quite a challenging process. I imagine many of you may be familiar with Shōmyō, but just in case, I'm going to play you a very short recording of Shōmyō for anyone who might not be familiar with it. And we hope the technology works. Fingers crossed. Okay. Sorry, let me start that again. Okay, the recording wasn't perfect, but hopefully it gave you some idea of what Shōmyō is like. And of course, you all have the option to go and listen to this because you can hear Shōmyō regularly in the services in Honganji. It is really beautiful, so I encourage you to check it out if you have the chance. Right, let me get back to the presentation. go. Okay. A different kind of music, which was introduced from the Meiji period, was Bukkyo Ongaku. So that's a Western style of Buddhist music. And this slide actually shows the same chant as the last slide, but this one written in Western musical notation. So you can see it's written very differently. And I wasn't able to find a recording of the two to play the two recordings. But if you listen to the Western music version and the Shōmyō version, they actually sound quite different. Now, the development of Bukkyo Ongaku was linked to a broader process of modernization in Meiji and the introduction of Western-style music to the school curriculum, and also the growing popularity of Western music as entertainment. And what Fukumoto-san, amongst others, also Asuka-san, argue, is that Western music in Japan became the most familiar kind of music, the generally understood musical language, if you will. So that these days, if you were to show those two versions, the one on the previous slide and the one on this slide, of this is the Sambujo that's shown on both of them, most Japanese people could understand this slide, and they couldn't understand or read the other slide, the previous one. So this has become what's most familiar to most Japanese people. This wasn't a smooth or quick process, though, particularly. The first service book, including 26 songs with Western-style melodies, was issued by Honganji in 1912. And the first full-scale ritual, called Ongaku Hoyo, so a ritual including Western-style music, was performed by a choral group affiliated with the Nishi Honganji Osaka Betsuin in 1917. And this leads us to an important point, which is that Bukkyo Ongaku is very often performed in choirs. So it's linked to choirs, and it's also linked to universities and high schools. So you can hear Bukkyo Ongaku in some of the Ryukoku Daigaku services, for example. Specialist music courses were established at Soai University and the Kyoto Women's University from the 1940s. And a number of universities and high schools in Japan have specialist choirs which will perform Bukkyo Ongaku of the universities associated with Jōdo Shinshū, I mean. And this slide shows choral Bukkyo Ongaku in Tsukiji Honganji in Tokyo. So this is an example of performing in choirs as part of a Buddhist ritual. One point that I want to make here is that it's not necessarily something for everyone to join in. It can be a performance demanding specialist skill. So songs may be written in Bukkyo Ongaku to be performed by trained soloists, for example. So it's a bit of a mixture. It may be choral performance, it may be songs to be sung all together, and it may be songs to be sung by a trained soloist. And one event might include a number of these different things. Okay. So if we look at the current situation regarding vocal music and ritual in Japan, just to summarize, some special services at Honganji Honzan and other large temples are performed in Bukkyo Ongaku style. For example, the Hoonko in January at Honzan has both a Bukkyo Ongaku version and also a Shōmyō Dokyo style version. But the majority of services use Shōmyō and Dokyo. So if you go to the daily services in Honzan, that's what you're likely to hear. Bukkyo Ongaku is particularly associated with Jodo Shinshū linked universities, as well as linked high schools and junior high schools. And an interesting point, I think, which I'm still trying to explore, is that Pali refuges, so the taking refuge in the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma, may also be included in collections of Bukkyo Ongaku and sung at universities. And this is interesting to me because it seems to echo this positioning of Jodo Shinshū in the context of a broader general Buddhism, by having these elements which are chanted in Pali. And it also features in services in the United States and Hawaii and in Europe. So this chanting of Pali refuges seems to be something which is developed in all three of the areas we're looking at. I don't know exactly when this originated or where it originated, so I would be very grateful if anyone has any more information on this. Some services in Japan may combine different forms of vocal music. For example, the recent Honko at Ryukoku University, which happened last week, included Western style songs, as well as chanting, dokyo, and shomyo style chanting. So you do find combinations. And services at local temples may also combine different forms of music. I went to a local temple in Osaka, where a service began with shomyo, continued with dokyo, collected chanting of the sutras, and finished with all of the people present joining in the ondoku-san, which has become a very popular Western-style Buddhist song. So you do find these mixtures. One final point I want to make before moving on, though, to the US and, well, actually, no, there's another thing I want to say about Japan, but one final point about these general services is that of performance versus participation. And I think it's important to note that the introduction of Western-style music in Japan does not necessarily mean that there's a move to services where all the congregation chant all the songs together. Western-style music, Bukkyo Ongaku, may often be a form of performance where not everybody joins in. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because I think there's a real difference here between this use of Western-style music and the use of Western-style music in the US and Hawaii, where it's much more likely to be the congregational singing, the type that we see in Protestant Christian churches. One more thing before we leave the area of Japan. I think probably I've made the point here that I hope I've convinced you that Japan is not a fixed point. It has changed a lot since the Meiji era. And I just want to note a recent innovation in Buddhist music in Japan by performers such as Asakura Gyosen, who is a Jodo Shinshū priest, and Tatsumi, also a Jodo Shinshū priest, who sing very innovative forms of services. So Asakura Gyosen does something which you can call Tekno Hoyo. And this is a picture of a service run by Asakura Gyosen. And I'm just going to try very quickly, if I can, to play you a short extract. This is from, it's actually from BBC YouTube, and apparently it's gone viral in the UK. So it's an example of Buddhist music internationalizing and spreading out from a Japanese innovation. So here we are, let's hope it works. Okay. So that's just to give you a very brief taste of this. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay. So I think there's actually a lot of innovation in music coming out of Japan, which is very interesting. So moving on to the USA and Hawaii. The context here is Japanese migration to the US and Hawaii from the late 19th century, as I mentioned before, and the establishment of Jodo Shinshū missions in Hawaii and California in the late 1890s. Japanese migrants experienced discrimination, pressures to fit in, and one of the results of this was an adaptation of ritual practice. For example, the establishment of weekly Sunday services. There were Christian influences here, but there were also influences of the broader frame of this emergent global Buddhism, with the new missions, especially in Northern California, trying to establish themselves in this context and to appeal to non-Japanese people as well, by trying to position themselves as promoting a more general Buddhism, not just specific to Jodo Shinshū. And this influenced the development of musical forms. Sunday services were modelled after Christian services. I mentioned before the importance of congregational singing. That's very typical of Protestant Christian churches, that all the congregations stand up and they sing hymns together. And you see the same kind of thing happening in Sunday services in the US and Hawaii. Also, a service book was written by Ernest and Dorothy Hunt, the Vade Mecum, and published in Hawaii in 1924. They were converts who were ordained as Jodo Shinshū priests, but wanted to promote a generic Buddhism. They were very opposed to what they saw as sectarian Buddhism, particularly Ernest Hunt. So in their service book, you can see a Christian influence, but also the influence of these ideas of general Buddhism. So, for example, instead of talking about Amida, you have lots of references to the Lord Buddha. Also, the Lord and King, which could just as easily be a reference to Jesus. It's the kind of language you hear in Christian hymns. Another example of the kind of language you hear in Protestant Christian hymns, there was a hymn written by Dorothy Hunt called Buddhist Soldiers, which is very reminiscent of the Protestant hymn Onward Christian Soldiers. So you can see a lot of Christian influence here, but also influence of general ideas of Buddhism, with the insistence on using the word Buddha rather than Amida. Very little reference to Amida, very little reference to anything we might associate with Jodo Shinshū, the Pure Land, the Nembutsu. If you look at the Vade Mecum, you see very little of that. This has changed over the years, and there's been a move away from the hymns written by Ernest and Dorothy Hunt, but it's still influential. It's still been formative in the way in which Shin Buddhist services in North America and Hawaii have developed, with this pattern of hymn singing, even though the hymns themselves are somewhat different now. And I would say it's also become part of American Nikkei identity for the older generation. I visited a temple in the US in 2011, and there was a service which was intended to introduce Japanese-style chanting. And the older people in the congregation really struggled with it. They weren't used to chanting things like the Sambutsuge and the Jusei-ge. They were used to hymns. And some of them said, oh, I like the hymns. They remind me of my childhood. So these have a sort of nostalgic resonance, I think, for the older generation in particular. And in the next slide, I just have an example of a gatha, a hymn written by Dorothy Hunt. And you can see here it talks about the Buddha a lot, doesn't mention Amida at all. And the language is quite a Christian sort of language. It could easily be a Christian hymn if you took out Buddha and substituted Lord or Jesus. Okay, current situation, as I said earlier, there's been a shift to more Japanese style sutra chanting, but sometimes this is done in English, especially in Hawaii, so that's another difference. Services may combine sutra chanting and singing of these Western style gathas. They also commonly include the refuges, the Pali refuges, Vandana and Tisarana at the beginning of the service. Sometimes these are also done in English, so there's quite a lot of use of English in Jodo Shinshū in the US and Hawaii. For the gatha section of the service, many of the Hunt's gathas are gone now. There are more references to Amida Buddha, where it used to say Buddha, often the word Amida has been brought back. So they look more Shinshū now. But you can still see the influence of this hymn-based service. One point that I want to make here is that if we consider Western style music in Japan and in America and Hawaii, it's developed along very different lines. So Bukkyo Ongaku is not the same thing as Western style music in America and Hawaii. However, there are crossovers. For example, the Ondoku-san, which I mentioned earlier, which is popular now in Japan. The first Western music version of this was actually composed in Hawaii in 1918, and it's come from Hawaii to Japan. And going the other way, the choral versions of Bukkyo Ongaku developed in Japan. Two choral versions of Juseige, sorry, spelling mistake there, and Sambutsuge were introduced to the Seattle Butsuin by a visiting Japanese priest, Toshikazu Arai, in 2000. So you have crossovers and things traveling both directions. Okay, final bit of the presentation before I draw some conclusions. Jodo Shinshū in Europe. So very briefly, the context. First contact happens in the late 19th century. There were visits to Europe by scholar priests, Akamatsu Renjo, who you'll all be familiar with, Nanjo Bunyu, Kasahara Kenju, Shimaji Mokurai, also Takakusu Junjiro, all very important names in the history of Meiji Buddhism. Several of these studied under Max Muller in Oxford. However, there seems to be very little impact of Jodo Shinshū in Europe at that time. There was also a Horonko service held in Paris in Musée Guimet. Some attempts to propagate Buddhism in Europe, especially by Akamatsu Renjo. But all this seems to have been around promoting generic Buddhism. And there's no evidence of Jodo Shinshū conversions in Europe at that time. We might ask why. Well, one reason is that Jodo Shinshū was not positively evaluated in 19th century Europe. In the emergent discourse of Buddhism as a world religion, the view of Buddhism, of what was real, authentic Buddhism, was strongly influenced by Theravada. And Jodo Shinshū had a particular problem in that aspects of Jodo Shinshū were perceived as being similar to Christianity. In particular, Shinjin was often translated as faith, and relying on Amida Buddha was seen as equivalent to the Christian notion of grace. And so for a number of intellectuals writing about Buddhism, Jodo Shinshū seemed inauthentic, and like a kind of Christianized Buddhism. So it tended to be dismissed, not taken seriously. And it didn't really feature in broader discussions about Buddhism. Another significant point here is Europe has no significant Japanese expatriate community. This is very, very important because Jodo Shinshū in Hawaii and the United States relied heavily on the expatriate, the migrant Japanese community as its base of followers. Europe did not have that base. So although in the United States and Hawaii there were some converts, non-Japanese converts from early on, they still had that base. And for ethnic Japanese migrants, there's no question. Is Jodo Shinshū Buddhism? Of course it's Buddhism. It's not even an argument. But it is an argument for Europeans who have this very negative image of it. So nothing really happens with Jodo Shinshū in Europe until 1954, when Shōnyo Shonin visited Europe and Harry Pieper converted in Germany. And from there, groups developed in Germany, the UK, Switzerland, Belgium, Austria, later also Romania and Poland. However, until quite recently, Jodo Shinshū continued to struggle with this question of, is it real Buddhism? And even just a few decades ago, the German Buddhist groups had an argument with the German Buddhist Union to allow Jodo Shinshū to be admitted, because the initial reaction was, but you're not real Buddhists. And one of the German priests at the time, Thomas Moser, said to them, hang on a second, our patriarchs, we have Nagarjuna, we have Vasubandhu, are you telling us that's not real Buddhism? I think it is. And so in the end, they did accept Jodo Shinshū. And I think now there isn't so much of this argument, is Jodo Shinshū real Buddhism? But historically, it's been important. Today, the main centres of Jodo Shinshū in Europe are Germany, UK, Switzerland and Belgium. And this slide shows you Echo House at the top, which is actually sponsored by Mitsutoyo, Numata and Mitsutoyo Foundation. But it's affiliated to Nishihon Ganju. And below you can see our centre in Southampton in the UK. This was right after 4 of us were ordained in 2019. So you can see the new priests lined up with our senior priest, Gary Robinson. Few important things to note for Jodo Shinshū. In Europe, it's a very small membership. Almost everyone is a local convert, and it tends to attract people who are interested in Buddhism. Many of the members have previously belonged to or experimented with different Buddhist groups, and there's a resistance to ritual forms which seem similar to Christian forms. And you need to see this in the context of the history of Jodo Shinshū in Europe, where there's been a long struggle to persuade Europeans we are not Christianity. In this effort to persuade people we are not Christianity, it doesn't help if you have music forms which sound Christian. So we haven't used those. So there's no enthusiasm for US style gathas. There's a preference for Dokyo style sutra chanting in Kanbun. It's rare that people chant in local languages in Europe. And I haven't systematically investigated this, but my feeling is it's because somehow chanting it in Kanbun makes it feel more authentic, I think. But one thing that people have adopted widely is chanting the refuges in Pali. Again, we find this as a common point. People have a problem with chanting in English, but they have no problem with chanting in Pali. That's absolutely fine, because that's clearly Buddhist. At least that's what I think, but yeah. However, there have been exceptions, and there was one interesting experiment I want to note here. This slide shows Jean Irac, who used to be the head priest in Switzerland. He was a former Roman Catholic priest, and he developed a French language liturgy based on Christian Gregorian plain chant. So he set the sutras to Gregorian plain chant. I met Iracle before he died, and he said he felt that the sutras were very well suited to this kind of plain chant. However, this initiative didn't survive the Reverend Iracle. It seems that most of the followers in Switzerland preferred to go back to a more traditional mainstream form of chanting the sutras in Camden. So his form of service has been lost. So, conclusions. I try to argue here that the model of acculturation based on the idea of a fixed centre and adaptations in the periphery is inadequate. And this is because of a few reasons. One, ritual practice in the centre, Japan, has changed considerably since Meiji. It's not fixed. Japan has changed and continues to change. Also, flows of influence don't just go one direction. Of course, Japan has been hugely influential in developing the services overseas, and Europe in particular has a tendency to look to Japan as a source. But there have also been influences in other directions, like the adoption of the ondoku-san in Japan, and more broadly, the influence of Western-style music in Japan. And I think we also need to note the importance of both large-scale globalizing influences, so for example, the importance of this idea of global Buddhism, but also specific local factors. And this includes the socio-cultural context, the history, and the influence of particular individuals. There are very detailed histories in different places. You can see the impact of individuals such as the Hunts, or Arai Sensei in Seattle, or Iracle, although his influence didn't last, but he was an innovator. So I think that these also need to be taken into account. And one other point I would make is that this case challenges any simple opposition between Japan and the West, and it also challenges the paradigm of Westernization. Ritual practice in Europe and North America is quite different. So you can't say that Jodo Shinshū spreads abroad and outside Japan, in the West, it has this kind of pattern. It doesn't. Europe and Japan are very, very different, and forms developed in America have not on the whole been adopted in Europe. And also, if you look at Western style music in Japan and in North America, they have also developed in different distinctive ways. So I think the opposition of Japan and the West doesn't really work. And final point, or questions. I really want to hand this over to you and to some discussion. So I'd like to ask some questions to all of you. What are the limits of adaptation? We've been considering how Jodo Shinshū ritual adapts to different local contexts, and how it adapts in Japan as well to changing times. Techno Hoyo, for example. What are the limits of this? Are there any limits? How far can we go in adapting ritual? important are ideas of authenticity here? I've suggested that for Europe, the question of whether Jodo Shinshū is an authentic form of Buddhism, so the problem, if you like, of authenticity, has been a serious one. But what does authenticity mean in the context of ritual? And does it mean the same thing everywhere? Even thinking about what it means in English, I found it difficult. It could mean conforming to an original form, so going back to the origins. It could mean conforming to an authorized form, the form the head temple says is okay. That's not quite the same thing. Or it could even refer to something true. Authentic can mean true and real. If we interpret it in that way, we say it's true, something true and real, then perhaps what matters is, does the form express the teachings? Does it express the intentions of the founder? And perhaps the argument of people who say, we need new forms of music, of ritual to appeal to people now. Perhaps that might be a very authentic form in the third sense. I also looked up meanings in Japanese and found even more possible meanings, but I think I will pass that question of how you might understand this in Japanese and whether indeed it's even important over to you. So I have a list of references on my slide and also in the handouts if you want to follow any of these ideas up. And I'd like to finish by thanking you all for listening. Thank you very much.